What's up, everybody, and welcome to our 6th video on American industrialization. The topic for this video is going to be worker power. In video 5, we left off with a brief recap of progressivism. And if you remember, progressivism is the idea that the government should actively intervene in the economy in an attempt to solve social problems. This was a departure from earlier laissez-faire theories that said the government should not intervene in the economy at all. Progressives succeeded in accomplishing quite a few impressive reforms, including the Clean Food and Drug Act, which stopped companies from putting dangerous and unsanitary things in our food. But many workers didn't really believe that the government could ever really be trusted to fix all the problems associated with industrial labor. Big business had a ton of influence in politics, and so many workers sought to take matters into their own hands by working together and forming unions in their workplaces. A union is an organization of workers that works together to try to win better wages and better working conditions. And to really understand the importance of these organizations, we have to remember that at the time there were virtually no standards for fair employment or workplace safety in industrial labor. The belief was that if you didn't like the wage you were getting paid, or you didn't like that your workplace was unsafe, well then you could just quit and find a new job. Unions sought to win better conditions and wages for their workplaces by using collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when a large group of people negotiate a contract together with the company to try to win better terms. I mean, think about it. If you go up to your boss and you say, "You better give me a raise or I'm leaving," he's probably going to tell you to take a walk. But if the entire workplace comes together and demands a raise, the boss is going to have to think about it because they can't fire everybody at once without shutting down the business, rehiring, and retraining people. Without acting collectively, there was really nothing a single worker could do to get better conditions for himself unless he had a really specific skill, which wasn't really common in the industrial era. These workers realized that the only power they could have against the business owners was through unity, and they won better terms by fighting together. The term for this type of action is solidarity, which means when a group of people are fighting for each other rather than for themselves individually. Unions' main tool in their tool belt to try to win better conditions for their workers was the strike. And a strike is when workers refuse to work until the boss agrees to some demand, whether it's a pay raise or better conditions or something along those lines. Strikes are powerful because, obviously, when no one is working, the company's not making any money. The hope of the workers being that if the company loses enough money through work stoppages, eventually they'll just agree to whatever demands they make. Strikes are usually accompanied by a picket line, which is when workers line up outside of their workplace and demonstrate until their demands are met. You may have seen one of these in present day, where workers may try to draw attention to the demands that they're making to get the public on their side, but in the industrial era, pickets had a very practical purpose. If, say, a factory went on strike, the boss's first mode of action would probably be to try to bring in new workers to do the jobs of the old workers. By picketing in front of the factory, workers could discourage other people from coming in and taking their jobs. By appealing to workers' sense of solidarity, shaming people who were coming in to take their jobs, or even using intimidation. People who would help break the strike by coming in and taking these people's jobs were often viewed very negatively by striking workers, and usually called scabs. Through strikes and collectively bargained contracts, many unions were able to win closed shops, which is where every worker in a workplace is automatically enrolled in the union. This helped keep workers unified and gave unions more power. And as unions grew to be national organizations with thousands of members, they often used electoral politics to gain more power, directing their members to back certain politicians that would be more sympathetic to unions and worker issues. But all of these gains were hard fought. And many companies and industries used their massive amounts of wealth to try to prevent workers from forming unions that would cut into their profit margins. Many businesses maintained blacklists, or lists of people who tried to organize unions and spread them to other companies, informing other businesses not to hire these, quote, troublemakers. Some businesses would practice lockouts on workers, which is sort of a strike in reverse, where they would shut down the shop and cut off everyone's pay until they agreed to take a pay cut. As mentioned before, businesses would often try to bring in strike breakers or scab workers to take the jobs of union workers, sometimes even offering them higher pay than the union workers requested as a way to try to break the strength of the union. And many times these companies resorted to out-and-out violence, using company security guards or hired thugs to attack union workers, sometimes even killing organizers. Sometimes the government would intervene on behalf of big business, like in the Pullman strike in 1894, when railroad workers were striking for better pay, so the federal government attached mail trucks to the trains and then arrested them for obstructing the mail. Dirty tricks like this were not uncommon in the attempt to put striking workers back to work at low wages, though those paled in comparison with the out-and-out violence that was sometimes used to break strikes. One of the most horrific examples of this was the Ludlow Massacre in 1914 in Colorado, when the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and Colorado National Guard opened fire on a camp of striking miners with machine guns, killing 20 men, women, and children. Hopefully these examples illustrate just how dangerous and challenging it was for workers to win better conditions in the industrial era. And due to these challenging conditions, several groups emerged with different theories about how to win these gains. Let's break these viewpoints down into two categories: trade unions and industrial unions. Trade unions, many of which were organized under the AFL-CIO, which is a group of labor unions that still exists today, placed an emphasis upon skilled labor and focused their efforts on organizing members of a particular trade, for example, electricians or plumbers or carpenters or teamsters who transport goods. By focusing on members of a particular trade, these unions were able to organize smaller groups of workers and maintain a higher degree of discipline between them. These unions tended to focus on what were called bread and butter issues, which were very concrete goals like winning better wages, shorter days of work, more time off, things like that. And these organizations tended to believe that by achieving these small victories step by step, they could fix the bigger issues of society through reform. Conversely, others believed in the philosophy of industrial unions, most famously the International Workers of the World, or IWW, who believed that skilled and unskilled workers, immigrant workers, and native-born workers should all unite under one union. For instance, trade unions were often anti-immigration because they saw immigrant workers as keeping wages down by adding to the surplus of labor, whereas industrial unionists would tend to support immigration and would want to organize immigrant workers to improve their conditions as well. Their philosophy was that bigger unions meant more power, but this philosophy was harder to implement because it was harder to organize bigger, more disparate groups of people. The biggest difference, however, between these two schools of thought about unions was really in their long-term goals. Like I said before, trade unions tended to be more reform-minded, fixing small problem after small problem, whereas industrial unionists tended to be more radical and revolution-minded. The IWW wanted to abolish the capitalist wage system entirely, and they pictured a world where industry wasn't owned by bosses, but by the workers themselves. They envisioned an economy that didn't accumulate profit at the top like the capitalist system, but instead distributed prosperity throughout the working class. This type of economy is commonly referred to as socialism. This philosophy was highly influenced by the writings of Karl Marx, a political philosopher and economist who wrote about the exploitation of all working people by the capitalist system and envisioned a coming revolution of the working class. Some people within the labor movement took these political ideas even further, including anarchists who advocated the violent overthrow of the state. These revolutionary beliefs were obviously very controversial, and as time went on, they became increasingly associated with immigrants and led to xenophobic attacks on labor leaders and activists that were often justified by fears of terrorism. Xenophobia, meaning the fear of immigrants or outsiders. Perhaps the most infamous example of this intersection between radical politics and xenophobia was the Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886, when, as police attempted to disperse a crowd of striking workers, somebody threw a dynamite bomb at the police, killing a police officer. Several more were killed in the ensuing shootout between strikers and police. After the incident, 8 men were arrested and put on trial. Of these 8, 6 were German immigrants. Over the course of the trial, it was determined that 6 of the men weren't even there that night, and the 2 that were complying with the police. In the end, 5 were condemned to death, and the other 3 were sentenced to life in prison. They were condemned because of their association with an anarchist newspaper that they believed helped contribute to the violent atmosphere of the strike. The 3 men in prison were later pardoned, as it was determined that this was a miscarriage of justice, that they were being punished more for their immigration status and political beliefs than for anything they actually did that night. A similar event was the Sacco and Vanzetti affair in 1920, when a violent bank robbery in Massachusetts was pinned on 2 Italian immigrants who were also anarchists, despite the fact that they both had alibis and no evidence really linked them to the scene. There were no immigrants on the jury, and the prosecutor leaned heavily on xenophobic ideas and stereotypes in his attempt to convict these 2 men. Despite the evidence, they were both found guilty and executed a few years later. Perhaps the most infamous example of this time period's dangerous combination of xenophobia and fear of terrorism were the Palmer raids in 1919. Under the direction of President Woodrow Wilson and District Attorney Palmer, U.S. authorities raided immigrant organizations across the country, newspapers, labor unions, neighborhood organizations, arresting over 3,000 immigrants and deporting 556 of them without a full trial. The immigrants most targeted by these deportations were labor leaders and people with radical political beliefs. These incidents illustrate that the stories of labor and immigration and xenophobia and radical politics are all kind of wrapped up together in American history, and how legitimate fears about terrorism were often conflated with xenophobia and prejudice, with the end result being the violation of civil liberties. This obviously has a lot of connections with 21st century history, but we'll leave that off for another time. Setting aside these extreme examples, it's important for us to remember that the story of labor unions in the United States is really the story of improved quality of life for workers. And despite the resistance of big business to the labor union movement, high union membership and increased wages for working class people actually was incredibly good for the economy. I mean, think about it. Higher wages in the hands of workers are spent in the economy stimulating growth rather than that money just sitting as excess profit in the bank accounts and pockets of the uber wealthy. Through unions, workers were able to win greater stability and prosperity and security in their work. Things that most good working jobs take for granted today, like an 8-hour workday, paid time off, sick leave, and other things, were essentially unthinkable 150 years ago and were won through labor activism. Though, unfortunately, over the last 50 years, labor union membership has declined steadily in the United States, as companies have outsourced jobs to countries without any workplace safety standards or where labor is cheaper. Factories that we see today in places like China and India very much resemble the dangerous, dirty factories of America 100 years ago. And as big businesses chase this cheap labor, more and more good union jobs are replaced by jobs in the service industry, which are often lower paying and much more precarious. In the beginning of this series, we talked about the industrial era as a kind of gilded age, where some people got extremely wealthy and others became very poor. And although we may not see the types of dangerous industrial factories that we associate with this era, we have to take a step back and look at our own time. Working class Americans in the 21st century are finding it harder to get by now than it was a decade ago, while the wealthiest classes of Americans are getting even richer. In 2019, the richest 10% of Americans owned 64% of the nation's wealth, while the poorest 50% owned only 6%. So that raises a few questions. Are we living in a modern Gilded Age? And what lessons can we learn about our own time by looking back at industrialization? I hope this historical context can give us some clarity on the world we live in. And with this knowledge, we can fight for a world that's not just gilded at the top, but decent all the way down. Since this is our final episode in this series, I thought I'd do something a little bit different for our primary source today. We're going to listen to the most famous song associated with the labor movement and labor unions, called Solidarity Forever. This song has endured and is still sung at labor meetings to this day because of how perfectly it captures the perspective of the industrial worker, both the challenges of industrial poverty and the promise of a better world through solidarity and cooperation. Here's my favorite version of the song by legendary American folk singer Pete Seeger. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the Union makes us strong.